Today, we welcome back to our network someone who's probably becoming a familiar face to our regular viewers. He's an author, radio host, podcaster, researcher, history fanatic, and a lover of philosophy, and a delver into all things Fortean. And his name is Micah Hanks. Micah, thanks for joining us for a third time. So going for a record here.
Well, hey, it's always good to be back and to be able to talk with you, Jazz. There's a lot going on in the world, so we're never want for something to be able to discuss, right?
That's a fact, particularly in the area of our mutual interest. I don't know if it's quite as hot right now in some areas as it used to be, but we'll get to that later. We should just dive right into it so I don't take up your whole day. The main thing that spurred me to reach out to you this week was your September 14th edition of your program, where you dug into two truly remarkable UFO cases from the past and the more distant past. And you talked about how they might relate to more recent events that we've been covering nonstop for the last few years, particularly the 2004 Nimitz Encounter. Those two are the October 1973 encounter involving United States Army Captain Lawrence Coyne and his helicopter crew. And the second one from about 5 years later is the disappearance of Freddie Valenich, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, in Australia in 1978. Now, just to help out the people who aren't real UFO historians, could you give us first just a short thumbnail summary of the Coyne incident?
Yeah, absolutely. And I should really preface it, Jazz, by saying that this occurred during a particular year of significance because there was a tremendous amount of not only attention being put toward the UFO subject, but that on account of the number of eyewitness accounts that were being provided. And some of them, like we're about to hear, were quite hair-raising and also involved military encounters, such as what is known as the Mansfield or the Coyne incident. It's named after the primary witness, who had been Army Reserve Captain Lawrence Coyne, but he had his flight crew with him at the time. They're flying in a Huey helicopter. The crew was Lieutenant Arrigo Jesse, Sergeant John Healy, and Robert Yanisek. I believe it was Healy who was in the left back position. All four men had just traveled to a routine medical examination and were flying back. At the time, Jesse is in the left pilot seat, and he is controlling the helicopter. Healy, directly behind him, first notices a light that looks sort of similar to what you might, compare to, I don't know, like a cell phone tower today, or a beacon, a red beacon on
Sure.
a broadcast tower. So he sees this light, doesn't pay much attention to it. But shortly thereafter, I believe Yanisek also is able to see it and brings it to the attention of the rest of the crew. Eventually, of course, they would all see it, but Coyne initially says, just keep an eye on it. Naturally, they don't want to collide with any kind of stationary object, but in their flight path, they don't expect that any stationary object is going to be a problem. However, it was quickly apparent that this object was moving toward them. It began to close a distance between them so quickly, and keep in mind, in the controlled airspace in which they were flying, they were unaware of any other traffic. And so they naturally conclude, at the speed it's moving and the characteristics of this flight, this seems to be some sort of a, highly maneuverable, probably some sort of a fighter jet of some kind. The object begins to approach so quickly that Coyne and his crew are essentially bracing for a potential impact. And so Coyne takes control of the Huey at that point, and he goes into a dive. And at this point, they realize that rather than a collision, the object is above and directly in front of them, and it does not appear to be moving any longer. It's hovering relative to their position. Yeah. Now, the object, and this is what's significant, because again, as you know, Jazz, I like to try and understand, historically speaking, how the study of the UAP issue, unidentified aerial phenomena, without projecting, any willful desire in terms of what it might be or its source could be, simply documenting the phenomena is important, because I think that could help us establish its provenance, in the sense that if we know it's been around for this long, it's highly unlikely that it is this or that if there is continuity between such reports. And what's interesting to me about this case is the description they give is not identical, but very similar to other kinds of tubular or cigar-shaped, more popularly today recognized as tic-tac, borrowing the terminology used by Commander Dave Fravor and also pilot Chad Underwood in relation to the 2004 Nimitz incident. Now, again, this craft was roughly oblong-shaped, tic-tac-like, but they also described there being some sort of a dome-like structure on top, a red and a green light they could now see. The green light was so bright that they say it entered the cockpit in almost like a scan, like if you've seen in a science fiction film, retinal scan or something. This light passes through the cockpit so light or so bright that they say that this green light actually wipes out temporarily the lights produced by the instrument panels inside the helicopter. And then it
I believe he
gradually
described it as flooding the cockpit.
Yeah. And then at this point, after flooding the cockpit and scaring the daylights out of these guys, I mean, literally it being night and it making it look like day, this thing is so bright, it begins to drift off first slowly and then picks up speed as it moves toward the northwest. At this point, Coyne, Jetsy, and the others begin to realize that they have descended a tremendous. Well, they actually had expected they were controlling the craft in a descent, but they realized that they're at a higher altitude than they had expected with their descent. So they were under the impression that this object might have somehow kind of towed them along, and rather than descending, they had actually ascended. So they regain control of the vehicle at this point, and then they, rather than stopping for fuel, they travel on completely to their destination and arrive almost with a empty tank, and they're very frightened by what happened. But again, if we were to say that objects the likes of which were filmed in 2004 in relation to the Nimitz incident that, like you said at the intro, has been so widely discussed, if these are technology that can be attributed to Russia or China, some sort of a fairly new technological innovation, it seems very difficult to imagine that by 1973 they also had that, or that perhaps decades beforehand these kinds of technologies were already in use. And yet we seem to have a historical delineation that shows that similar craft had been observed at least by the Second World War and, of course, immediately thereafter.
But now, correct me if I'm wrong, Coyne gave a more specific description of the object, of the vehicle, whatever you want to call it, and he included some dimensions, right? At least an estimate of dimensions.
Yeah, that was also significant because the estimate that he gives is roughly the size of the fuselage of, again, we could compare it to the Navy pilot's aircraft that, Fravor was flying at the time. If we take a conventional fighter jet today, an A-10 Hornet or something, comparable, generally it's going to be a little larger than the fuselage, but roughly the same length, but no sign of wings, no sign of any kind of, rudders, propeller, any kind of, stabilization. No, this thing is completely smooth, and with the exception of this dome on top, there appears to be no other kind of appendages, nor any kind of plainly evident means of propulsion. Now, that's a very interesting description, of course, because the way that this object is described, he thought this must be some sort of a high-performance military vehicle. I mean, they're not thinking aliens from outer space or anything like that at that point. They're thinking, we must be dealing with some kind of an aircraft, but we can't identify it. We don't know what it is. But it quickly became evident that based on the size, again, roughly we might say about the length of a city bus, right? They said this was no aircraft of any kind of provenance we could identify.
Yeah, but again, correct me if I'm wrong, Coyne specifically referenced it being, was it him or Fravor? No, it was him, right? That referenced it being basically the size of the fuselage of one of those fighters, like an F-18 or something.
I believe.
Right?
Now, I make that comparison when I discussed this recently on my podcast. Fravor absolutely made that comparison. When asked about the so-called Tic Tac, they said, how large was it? And he said, again, it's roughly, we're talking about like, I think you just said the fuselage of an F-18, sans wing.
Oh, okay, hang on. So it was Fravor who said that. Then it was Coyne who took a shot in the dark and said that it was around 60 feet.
Correct.
And between 15 and 20 feet high.
Correct, yes. And that roughly...
And you went and looked up, and I went and looked it up too in preparation for the show. The fuselage of an F-18 without the wings and all that is 18 feet high and 58 feet long.
Correct.
So that's pretty close to 60 by 15 to 20.
Give or take about 4 feet. Yeah, that was the minor discrepancy. But again, you got to keep in mind that Coyne and his crew didn't have measuring tape. They weren't getting out there
Right.
and saying, hold still, we're going to. But again, the rough comparison to the description that Fravor gave in terms of the size, I found that to be of significance because, again, it seems to suggest, at very least, a very similar craft, both in terms of its operability, also in terms of its rough size, dimensions and the like. Now, the description, of course, given by Fravor in 2004, being a daylight encounter, didn't entail bright green lights or anything like that.
Right.
But, I spoke with Gary Voorhees, who had been one of the radar operators, operating on board the USS Princeton at the time of the incident in 2004. Gary Voorhees said that at night, occasionally, we could see what he described as illuminations out in the distance over the ocean that appeared almost like phosphorus. And that's what it reminded him of. And he recalled running up to the top deck when they would paint something on radar that they couldn't identify, because this, again, they were getting all kinds of interesting, they were painting all kinds of different, I don't know, what would you call it, phenomena over the course of a couple of weeks around the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, so these anomalous targets, yes, would show up. And he said, yeah, on a couple of occasions, I'd run up to the top deck, with a pair of binoculars, see if I could actually get a visual. And he said, yeah, we would see these he said it was difficult to make out, but there were little illuminative phenomena that could be observed off in the distance. So he seemed to correlate that with the anomalous targets that they were detecting at the time. Nothing as clear as what Commander Fravor described, but certainly there was a luminous capacity to those observations.
Well, what he's describing is, if anybody's wondering, is that something somebody would really do? I'll remind you, I spent several years as a U.S. Navy radar technician, and that's what people do. There's a lot of free time out at sea, particularly in the evening, and you pick up something on radar, and if you're not that busy, yeah, you go up to the signalman's perch and go look and see if you can see it. So that makes sense.
Yeah.
The second encounter that you touched on the show that I referenced, and I wanted to bring up today, was the disappearance of Fred
Valentich. Yeah, Valentich.
Valentich? Okay. I've no idea. And that's weird because I've gone back since then and watched like 10 videos about this to try to get up to speed on it.
Yeah.
Again, if you could give people just the short version of that and then see if we can draw another similarity that might tie all three of these things together.
Well, what was interesting, and again, I want to be careful not to try and say that, we're dealing with the exact same aircraft or the exact same kind of aircraft. Again, there are some notable differences between Coyne's, so there are going to be some differences. More than anything, what is of interest to me is to try and just establish general characteristics of the performance and dynamics of these aircraft, if indeed what we're talking about are anything we could liken to aircraft. But I digress. October yet again, but a few years later, the year in question now, 1978, Frederick Valentich was a pilot, 21, 22 years old at the time. He was a young pilot, but he had some time. And in that, I mean, of course, flight experience in hours. And in fact, he was in preparation at that time for a forthcoming test. His stated trajectory was to fly to King Island, and he was coming back that night. And in fact, afterward, he and his girlfriend at the time were going to be going out for dinner afterward. More on Rhonda in a moment.
Before you continue, for those who really aren't familiar, we're talking about the west coast of Australia.
Correct.
What's the major city that he was right near?
Well, he was probably closest to Melbourne, and that's
Melbourne, right?
That's where air traffic control.
Mm-hmm. King Island is off the coast, and it's about halfway between mainland Australia and Tasmania. And
Correct.
His plan was to go to this small island across this strait. Yes. Called King Island. So sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
That's okay. No, thank you. Thank you for the background. That's really good, Jazz. I can always rely on him for that. But are you a writer by chance? No.
I'm hoping someday. Yeah.
Valentich. Yeah, me too. Valentich is flying over the Bass Strait en route toward King Island. And he begins to communicate with air traffic control in Melbourne. And he is describing that first he's inquiring, kind of like Coyne, do we have any traffic at this altitude, And he begins to describe an object that he initially says seems to be playing like a game. He says that it's orbiting around me and I'm kind of orbiting around it. So they're kind of flying circles around one another. Valentich maintains contact with Melbourne ATC, but he intermittently, is flying, and then he'll check in. After a few minutes, he checks back in and he says, essentially, the object, Melbourne, this is, Delta Sierra Juliet, the object is directly above me. It's directly above me, it's hovering, and it's not an aircraft. and he had described that there was green light. This object had a green light on it. And so that's again significant because that's similar to the kind of green light that was described by Coyne. And at the time that Valentich explains that it's hovering and it's not an aircraft, at that point, Melbourne ATC hears what's likened to metallic scraping for about 14 seconds. And then they apparently lose all contact with Frederick Valentich. Now, it's presumed he crashed into the ocean or something happened, but no wreckage was ever found. Now, that's also not necessarily hard to imagine looking at, more famous and recent incidents like MH370. I mean, it's certainly not impossible for a large aircraft to essentially vanish off the face of the earth, with the exception of the flaperon that was found at La Reunion Island in the case of MH370. With Valentich, there was a cowl from a Cessna that turned up, but it wasn't attributable directly to his aircraft. To my knowledge, there was nothing that was bona fide 100%, couldn't be correlated anywhere else. This had to have been from the Cessna he'd been flying which I think was a 182L at the time. But again, I'm no aircraft expert. In fact, I think I erroneously earlier referred to a Hornet when we were talking about F1, the aircraft we were just talking about. So, but
yeah,
so,
the F-18 is a
F-18.
yeah.
Yes. Again, numbers.
I did see one report that was never substantiated. Some divers claimed they had found the wreckage of a Cessna in the Strait, but either it wasn't investigated, or they were wrong, or it was a hoax, or whatever. But yeah, he pretty much disappeared. I will also note that the Australian equivalent of the FAA, when they were investigating this, reported that that model of Cessna, it was not a seaplane, but it did have air pods in 4 different locations. It was designed, if it hit the water, to float. Even if it broke apart, the pieces should have floated, some of the major pieces. And they never found anything, which I found really peculiar.
Well, it is interesting. And the general consensus, the more skeptical interpretation would be that he's flying his Cessna along. Now, again, I should point out there's some issues because King Island, they did have a small landing strip there at the airport on King Island, but the lights hadn't been turned on. In other words, they had not apparently expected Valentich, and apparently his flight log didn't indicate that they had been notified that he was planning to fly there. So it's a question of, well, was he really planning to fly there at all? There are a lot of questions about what his motive and intent had been. Further, of course, the general skeptical conclusion is that the 182L was flying upside down and he wasn't seeing a green light on an object, that he had been seeing green light from probably the exterior of his own aircraft reflecting off of the water below him, but that he was flying upside down. Now, to that point, I was recently in communication with a retired pilot who had said that variety of aircraft, again, I make no claim to be an expert on aircraft, so I err to the judgment of pilots when they tell me things like this, that aircraft, again, if he were flying upside down, would have probably stalled out because the oil, the configuration with that aircraft, it wouldn't have been capable of flying upside down for very long. Further,
I saw the same thing. It was like in less than a minute, the fuel flow would have cut off.
Right.
Being upside down. That was the longest it could go.
Correct. Yeah. Yes. It wouldn't have lasted very long. He might have been able to fly upside down temporarily, but again, the fuel flow is going to be interrupted and he's not going to be able to continue like that. Now, I spoke with and actually remained in contact with and, consider her a friend, Rhonda Rushton. This was Freddie's girlfriend at the time. Rhonda, I asked her when we spoke a few years ago for the first time, I said, Rhonda, did you ever fly with Freddie? And she says, oh, yeah. She routinely would fly with him when he was piloting. And I said, did you guys ever fly upside down? And she said, Freddie was actually fond of loop-de-loops and things. And she said that, yeah, there had been instances when she had actually been in similar aircraft with him when it would have been temporarily upside down while performing such a maneuver. And she said that when you're upside down, you know it. She says, first of all, your radio would have been dangling beside you. There's no way, she said, that he could have been flying that aircraft upside down and not been aware of that at that time. So I found that interesting. I also asked her, I said, were you ever contacted by Philip Klass or any of the skeptics who have made that argument? She says none of them ever reached out to her. But the most significant thing about this case that she told me, Jazz, was the fact that she said she worked at a chemist at the time, which essentially, is like, one of our pharmacies. Yeah. And so she said that she called her parents because she was going to get off work late. And she asked her parents, will you guys run me out there to the airport? Freddie's going to be waiting on me. Now, keep in mind, this is in the era before cell phones. And so
Right.
she had no other way of reaching him out there at the airfield. Her parents said, we've got plans. We can't help you out. And so she was running late. Well, there had been questions about why, with the flight plan that he had logged, why Valentich had actually waited around for what seemed like an hour before he actually left, and left much later, and thereby, of course, was flying closer to dark, which was more dangerous. He might have been a fairly experienced pilot, didn't have that many nighttime flight hours. The reason he seems to have left late, as clarified by Rhonda, had been that he was waiting on her. She was supposed to fly with him, and then they were going to come back and go out to dinner and celebrate their 6-month anniversary. So it's fairly tragic, and made only more troubling to me by the fact that another supposition that skeptics have offered had been that he probably had a girlfriend on King Island that he was sneaking off to go see. Well, that doesn't seem very likely if Rhonda was supposed to fly with him that night, right?
Yeah. I'll tell you what, we could debate that case for 3 hours, but excuse me. I want to steer us back around. The one key takeaway when I finished listening to the show was, here's another case 5 years apart from the coin encounter, where somebody is reporting before tragically being lost, green light flooding into the cockpit again. And he also mentioned, because I went back and listened to, they don't have the original recording of the chatter with the tower, but the people who investigated it did produce recreations of it. And included in the transcript, they asked him what the vehicle looked like. And he didn't say cigar shaped, he didn't say tic tac, but he did say it was long. I don't remember if it was long and thin or it was long and something, which gave you the impression of a lengthy thing, which it's not very hard to imagine if it was a, quote, cigar shaped object.
Right.
That you could have had yet another instance with some long, skinny, relatively skinny object flooding green light into somebody's cockpit. And that when you match that together, minus the green light because it was daytime, with David Fravor, that just led me to this probably improper conclusion that it just strikes me more and more that David Fravor changed the language of ufology, because for a long time everyone said cigar-shaped object and Fravor said tic tac. But can we rule out the possibility it's the same thing and they've been with us for a long time? This didn't just start happening in 2004.
Right. Again, I would maintain that absolutely this is a phenomena that has been with us for quite some time. Again, we could conservatively say that contemporaneous with the Second World War, and I don't mean 1947 Kenneth Arnold immediately afterward. I mean, of course, Foo Fighters, 1946, of course, we have the so-called ghost rockets. Again, prior to 1947, there were some very remarkable descriptions of similar aircraft seen over the United States. Captain Puckett, Jack Puckett, had been a pilot with Strategic Air Command, and he, I believe, was flying a C-17 en route to MacDill Air Force Base in August of 1946. And he and his crew also described that a long cigar-shaped object nearly collided with their aircraft while they were flying. Now, again, that's the year before Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting, which, again, like you're saying of Fravor, kind of defined how we would not only refer to and the terminology we would use to discuss UAP, i.e. flying saucer. And he didn't use that expression. That was the ones that the journalists, of course, had used for the description he gave of the way it flew, like a saucer skipping across water. But again, that not only defined how we would refer to these things, it also put this image in our mind of what UAP is supposed to look like. I've seen Chris Albeck and a number of other historically inclined UFO researchers like myself who make that argument. Who says that's what a UFO looks like? If you look at, and actually there's a tremendous amount of diversity, which has been very problematic, both for the advocates and the skeptics over the years. You have a lot of different descriptions of both the shape and also the different dynamics and behavior of these craft from over the years. But again, we've got to throw out that idea that, they look like this or that they look like that. But one thing we certainly do see is that there is a lot of similarity between Fravor's description and that of earlier descriptions of craft, which might apply to Valentich and also to Coin.
Yeah, you go back a long ways, it was the saucers, the discs. Although they don't go away entirely, because on another one of your recent shows, we have the incident from O'Hare, which was not that long ago, and those were people describing a disc. people with the cigar-shaped objects, V-shaped objects, and triangles, and another category that's orbs. Who's to say? Maybe they're all real. Maybe they're not all from the same place. Fascinating stuff, but nothing that we could prove on short notice here.
Yeah.
Okay, that was fascinating, and I thank you for sharing that with us, because I know you're not seeking to prove anything. We haven't proved anything, but that historical record, and if there are Tic Tacs or cigar-shaped things, and they go back into the 70s or before, I think we have to start wondering more and more, well, if you want to say it's the Russians or the Chinese, did they have that long ago? So just something to ponder.
Exactly. Well, really quickly on that point, Jazz,
Sure.
again, that's such a good point that you raised, because I have had this conversation, believe it or not, with several different people just within the last 48 hours that I've been corresponding with. You'll see that terminology, or that description, of what these things might be. A notable instance has been in some of the op-eds written by Christopher Mellon of the To the Stars Academy, that have appeared in The Hill and the like. He has said, it's incumbent upon us to look at this. It could be Russia or China, and we don't want to let that slip by us. We don't want any stereotypes or any kind of stigmas that have become associated with UAP or UFOs over the years. The whole effort to kind of rebrand this as UAP, although that had been used, decades ago. I think that, in early Air Force literature, you'll see the expression unidentified aerial phenomena. That's nothing new, but it's distinct from UFO. And of course, the idea is that UFO, like flying saucer before it, has become somewhat stigmatized. But again, when I see Christopher Mellon and others making that argument, what we really are seeing, and I think this is important to point out, is an appeal to government and military leaders in a way that will convey the immediacy and the importance in this moment to them. If I sit here or you sit here and we say, hey, in 1947, somebody saw some stuff flying through the sky, that's not going to have the same impact on our politicians and military leaders as saying, right now, or within the last few years, Russia and or China may have developed a game-changing technology. Now, we should really be looking at that, shouldn't we? So again, we have to understand the reason for what I think we could effectively call strategic communication when we're phrasing this phenomena in that way. I understand why Christopher Mellon and others have done that, but I think that we need to look deeper beyond that and understand the reason for phrasing the phenomena in those terms. I don't think, if we look at the history, that it's very likely that this belongs to another world power.
You know what? That's a very good lead in. So to stay on that topic, the announcement of the formation of the UAP task force that took place back in August, the official announcement, it had been out before that, along with the work by the Senate Select Intelligence Committee and their call for a public report on UAP investigations. I think that left a lot of people at least a bit more hopeful that we were entering this new era of openness on the part of the government, and particularly when it comes to UFOs. But as I wrote recently, some comments from Pentagon spokeswoman Susan Goff, and it's pronounced Goff, by the way, made it sound like, at least to me, they don't really have any intention of updating the public and sharing very much. And people who read Hot Air have already seen this. She stated that there were, national security reasons that, these sightings and the information about them that were being analyzed would be inappropriate to share with the public. And then our mutual friend, I'm going to kill myself, Tim McMillan, found something recently that I found fascinating, and I sent it to you so we could chat about it offline. I assume when I see someone who's a spokesperson in the government or in a political campaign anywhere, that's somebody that got picked up for the job, sort of learns on the go. In the government, it's very often somebody who is a GS blankety blank who got a promotion and an opportunity arose somewhere else, and now you're going to go with this. So a lot of times they land there, kind of have to hit the ground running and learn what's going on so they can go out and deal with the press, which
Sure.
is their job. It turns out that Susan Goff wasn't like that at all. She's a retired military colonel at least, and she wasn't just anywhere. She was an Army communications person who wrote one of their standing, apparently benchmark papers on I'm trying to remember exactly what. Oh yeah, that's right. About strategic control of information,
Mm-hmm.
and she's been referenced all over for that. And she was well up the food chain, and she has the resume of someone who, this is just me saying, but if I was looking for someone to be a disinformation specialist, she has the resume that qualifies for that. And suddenly, instead of having some vaunted job like that a year and a half ago, she gets plucked up, and suddenly she's the sole spokesperson for the entire Pentagon for any questions about UAP. If you put that information, Micah, together with what I was saying about the statement she already released and how little confidence that instilled, um, do you think the government's getting ready to be more open and transparent and maybe moving towards the big D, disclosure?
Well, if you know me, I've never put very much stock in the whole idea of disclosure anyway. I mean, and I've had a lot of pushback, over time about that. And really, it's fairly complex to try and wade into. But why not? Let's go for it. I'll try and condense it. So, you know, the UFO phenomena is inherently, and again, that is if there is some sort of a technological presence. I lean toward that based on the, deep study of historical narratives that are provided, like those of the coin encounter, Valentich and otherwise. Now again, the problem with Valentich is it's very interesting. He's giving us a real-time description. Air traffic control is in dialogue with him about it. Something happened and he vanished. But that's actually, in my opinion, less useful than an account like that of Coin, where you have 4 surviving witnesses who all saw this thing with
Right.
military backgrounds, right? So those are important to study in those terms. But even then, what we're left with is what some people said that they saw. And, this goes all the way back in the 1960s to Jacques Vallée, the eminent computer scientist and astronomer, who has really spent his entire life being involved in the study of this. And he wrote in Anatomy of a Phenomenon that, you can't study a UFO in a laboratory. That's not something that you can apply the tools of science to in that way. But it is not to say that science can't be applied to it. What we can do is we can study the UFO report. That is something that can be scrutinized a little better. And so he identified something that's very important early on, and that is that UFO research often has to rely more on what people say that they have seen, and then we have to try and consider how they have interpreted what they've seen and how that is filtered through the senses and the like. That's what often we are studying, more often than the actual UFOs. And I'm very hopeful, therefore, that with the recent advent of technologies, even though they've been around for a couple of decades now, the Raytheon's at-FLIR targeting pod and the like, utilized by the Navy and others, which is able to actually glean more instrumental data that might be useful in the furtherance of making scientific determinations. That's really important. Now, what does that have to do with disclosure? Well, again, we've already established that much of UFO research relies on what people say and people do and human behavior. I often find that many people who are UFO researchers, and this is fine, this is an entirely justifiable position, but many UFO researchers, rather than trying to study the phenomena, they actually focus almost entirely on how it relates to government operations and activities. And I've done a fair amount of this. I've got pending FOIA requests to various agencies right this moment related to the UFO phenomena. So again, I do that aspect of it also, but I'm making the observation that often people appealing to government or looking at what witnesses said or how they reacted, that is really more the sum total of quote unquote ufology than actual study of the phenomena. Now, you look at the idea that the government is withholding information and that it's going to be released. That idea to me has always been a little dubious because I'm not certain, one, that the government really has all that much information that they're withholding. And even if they do, how likely is it, based on, again, what history shows us, that they're going to be forthcoming with information about that? We can look back to the years of Project Blue Book and we see the same sort of little cat and mouse game. It seems unlikely to me that all of a sudden there's just going to be tremendous public pressure placed on government and they're going to finally say, you know what, the dam just broke. We're letting out all the files. Here's the crash retrieval or whatever that we have or don't have. I don't see that as being a realistic outcome of applying political pressure on government. Now, it is hopeful, however, seeing Senators Marco Rubio et al., asking for the establishment of a UAP task force and a report that will identify what various government agencies are going to, what they may have in their possession now and what they are going to allegedly report and provide information about. But again, to think that the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or that the CIA, or that, any other organization that maintains operational security through secrecy, that they're going to release information that hasn't already been released through FOIA requests and the like, and that for some reason that report's going to be made publicly available without redactions, it makes almost no sense, Jazz. So again, for me, this is one reason why I try not to get too bogged down with the idea of pressing for disclosure, because if on that outside chance that they don't have more information about this phenomena than civilian researchers do, we're putting a lot of time, effort, and energy toward the mere hope that the government will be forthcoming with information that, again, it is possible they don't have very much of. And if that's the case, might we not do better to apply that effort and energy towards scientific studies of the phenomena itself? I mean, that's just my take on it.
Your point is, you and I are basically on the same page. I was about to say the same thing in response. We're really dealing, in my opinion, with two different questions. One is the government's attitude changing towards disclosing things that it might still feel are very much a matter of national security. They may believe, whether we agree or not, that there's a good reason for not disclosing such things. But even more importantly, what, if anything, do they have to disclose? If they were taking 3 videos, I bet they've got a lot more videos, or at least had them at some point. They probably have a lot of reports that they haven't disclosed. I have no trouble believing that. Do they have a lot more than that? Do they have physical remains? I'm going to turn back once again to what has become, just this past year, one of my favorite quotes in the entire field of ufology, and it's from John Hopkins University astronomer Dr. Richard Henry. And this wasn't recent. He said this back in 1977. He said, and I've just pulled it up in front of me right here so I don't get it wrong, "I very much doubt that an intellectually inferior species could study an intellectually far superior species if the superior species chooses not to be studied."
Good point.
So with that in mind, we're still using 21st century technology. If you're assuming this is something that's come from somewhere else in the galaxy, they're probably somewhere well ahead of that. I think it's still entirely possible that, as I said, our government, other governments, maybe they got some more videos, they got some more interviews. Maybe something fell to Earth at one point, some odd material. But to think that they've got hangars full of, flying saucers that they're doing tests on, it strikes me as improbable, but who knows? We're getting close to the end, but I did have one more topic I definitely wanted to hit with you.
Sure.
Before we go, and that's, you and I have a shared interest in how the media covers this subject.
Mm-hmm.
And so you already know what's going on. You talk about it on your show every week. I do too. Excuse me. Hopefully I don't have one of the things we're going to talk about.
Oh.
I know you monitor and comment on how, specifically here in the United States, particularly how the media covers the subject you and I are discussing right now. But despite all of the big news that's broken in ufology in the past couple of years, 2020 has been, let's just say, a wild ride, to put it mildly.
Oh, yeah.
What with all the news about the elections, of course, that's big. The pandemic still raging, all the protests and riots in the cities. There's a ton of stuff going on. And my question for you is, do you get the sense, at least over the course of the summer, that the media attention that they had been placing on UFO related news items has been sort of sliding towards the back page? Or do you think it's still getting the fair amount of attention, but there just haven't been any new really big breaking things?
I think more than anything, it's the latter. Tim McMillan and I have done a lot of, study independently of the way that data and trends convey interest in UFOs, or rather, maybe we would phrase it like this: the way that the public engages that subject and what the results are, and if there are identifiable trends based on that. And, you can look at any kind of genre, news, science, tech, whatever, any subject, any genre. And you'll generally see that there are periodic trends that kind of follow the ebb and flow of the seasons. You're going to see a lot less, interaction in the summertime and things like this. It's always interested me that if I do like a 10-year outlook and I'm looking back at UFO reporting and the way that UFOs are engaged by the public, no predictable trends whatsoever. I mean, all you will see is a very erratic kind of response, and generally in response to news when it happens. So what that tells me is that when a story that is newsworthy breaks, people respond to it, and people do respond big to UFOs, but then that interest will taper off and it will go back into a kind of a quiet period. And then if there's another big story, you'll see a big response. Now, I will also point out, however, that since 2017, a few commentators have, and I've wondered about this also, I've wondered if the public isn't becoming somewhat, um, you know, acclimated to UFO reporting, because when the Pentagon came out and officially disclosed the three videos obtained by the Navy, which, keep in mind, they were already in the public domain and known to exist, but they were confirmed. I thought it was really big news because the videos on them, on their own are interesting. The Pentagon coming out and saying that, after looking at these videos and, performing the assessment and making the necessary inquiries, we did not determine that they depict anything that is classified or sensitive to national security that would, prevent them from being released. And therefore, we are clearing them for release and acknowledging them. And further, we are doing that so as to assure people that there aren't longer versions or different versions of these videos. Here's what we've got, and we are officially releasing those. Okay, well, there's still some questions about all of that, but it was significant nonetheless to see the Pentagon actually issuing such a statement and saying, hey, whatever is in those videos, we don't know what that is. We cannot identify it. That in itself was pretty significant. You would think that would be maybe one of the biggest stories of the century, at very least the biggest story of the new century. And it did not seem to get the same attention that, the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back, back in 2017 when Leslie Kean and Ralph Blumenthal, did their first piece for the New York Times with Helene Cooper, of course. That was a big splash. So was their follow-up article. Tim's Popular Mechanics piece was, fairly well received, but coming after those two, they got a little less attention. And by that, I mean the one that came out earlier on Valentine's Day this year.
Right. The Valentine's Day Massacre. Yeah.
That's what I like to call it. Again, I mean, to me, there was information in that article that was as, groundbreaking, if not more so than a lot of previous reporting. But it does seem, and Tim and I have noticed this and others too, that subsequent reporting, on the UFO subject since 2017 has seemed to have been met with a general decline in interest. That doesn't mean that people aren't interested, but I definitely think that strongly suggests that people have somewhat acclimated to it. So, make of that what you will, but the way that the media reports on UFOs certainly does, if nothing else, keep it in our minds and keep us interested. And despite the way that I see a little less engagement per news story as they appear, since 2017, I think that more broadly speaking, I think Tim would agree, we see a whole lot of interest that has been maintained throughout in this subject. And I see that in response to, when I do that topic on my podcast, and hence one of the reasons I talk about it so much, in addition to just loving the subject and really wanting to try to, provide some historical commentary on it. But I think that what we see right now is that, broadly speaking, there is maybe more serious interest in this phenomena, arguably, than at any time since at least the middle 1960s.
I tend to agree. When that report came out, when the release came from the Pentagon, when they acknowledged the three videos that you just discussed, I still remember, I believe, I'll have to double check this, it was one of the guys at Vice, but it was somebody we both follow who's on social media, very active. And after there was a little time for it to be digested and it showed up in a few of the usual sources and we were discussing it, this guy came out on Twitter and said, I still remember almost word for word the tweet. He said, the Pentagon just acknowledged that UFOs are real. And apparently nobody gives a crap, except he didn't say crap. I'm just cleaning it up a little for this show. Yeah. And I read that and I laughed, and just for a couple seconds, and then I stopped laughing. I was like, oh, you're right.
Yeah.
You're right, because there's nothing on the front page of the Washington Post. CNN's not talking about it. It's out there for anybody to find. It's not being hidden. Sorry, but yeah, I maybe that is a byproduct of what you were saying, that the media knows what gets clicks. They know what people are excited about. We've fed them enough UFO information for 3 years now that I think a lot of people don't find it that shocking anymore. It's like, oh, so it turns out there is stuff flying around we don't know. Well, if you find out what it is, let us know. And meanwhile, I got an election to focus on, or I'm hiding my kids from COVID.
Yeah.
So who knows? All right, I have taken up. You've been too generous with your time already, sir. Before we go, I'll just say right up front, I will include links in the show notes to some information about the coin incident, the Valentich incident. I will also have links to where you can find all of Micah's books. But can you just let everybody know before we go, perhaps those who haven't seen you here before, where can they find you? And please also, because I find it so fascinating, just give us a taste of some of the many other podcasts that you do and the topics that you cover, because you really cover a spread of stuff that people would find interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in everything. I mean, I could really kind of, try to narrow it all down to history and anthropology are my main interests, but then next day it'll be astronomy or something. So, MicahHanks.com is my website. That's where you can find everything I do. MicahHanks.com/shows is where you can do all the or find all of the podcasts that I produce. The main show, the flagship, is the Micah Hanks program. We do just discuss UFOs a lot, but I mean, I try to keep every week, especially in the news segments, plenty of discussion of science, not even just anomalous or fringe or, disruptive science. I'm just trying to talk about science. That's always been something very important to me, is to try to be in what, ways that I can be a science communicator. But I think that science should equally be put toward UFOs, and so we talk a lot about that and other things too. Now, some of the other shows I actually do a news and current events podcast called Middle Theory, which is very much more similar to the main line of work that you do with Hot Air. And with Middle Theory, rather than it being, I think a lot of people think of it as being like a centrist or libertarian sort of podcast. Really, the main thrust is this: I try to step out of any kind of ideological perspective and just report on the news, right? And just try to give an unbiased perspective. And that's increasingly difficult to do these days, which is, again, why I admire guys like you who are constantly reporting on current events, politics, and things like that, especially in these times. So that's Middle Theory. That can be found at Middle Theory.
Let me say this about Middle Theory, by the way. Not only is it great, but Micah, in my opinion, approaches politics the same way he approaches science, paranormal things, everything else. Neither from the left nor from the right. Not a believer, not a devotee, not a debunker. Willing to look at it, evaluate each piece on its merits, and move forward from there.
Absolutely.
I hope you don't disagree with that.
No,
I like your approach.
That's perfect. Yeah. And there are other shows too. Again, Seven Ages, which is archaeology. I've also got a new podcast all about citizen science and the search for relic hominoids, all kinds of crazy stuff. So, again, I love anthropology.
And what's the name of that last one?
That one, it's actually called Sasquatch Tracks. Yeah.
Sasquatch Tracks. And let me save everybody time, folks. You don't need to watch that one. Bigfoot's real. But you can still tune in. There's a lot of interesting discussions, but really the case is closed.
Yeah, this guy will tell you that. Yeah, see, again, on that subject, I'm maybe the more skeptical of the two of us, but I still enjoy that topic. And I think, yes, culturally, scientifically, and otherwise, we should be talking about it. But I've heard Jazz Shaw's stories, ladies and gents. So, who knows? Maybe you're going to have to end up on that show with us sometime, okay?
Hey, my pleasure.
Yeah, so it's always a pleasure.
I just hate to shoot the bottom out of your whole thing. You're sitting there saying, is it possible? And it's like, well, I already saw one. If I hadn't, I would look at the evidence and be, oh, that looks pretty dodgy. But then it's like, well, yeah, except I saw one. So.
Except I saw one. Listen, I'll leave you with this. Again, to me, anthropologically speaking, especially since we've, soundly refuted the old single species hypothesis, we know that humans, anatomically modern humans, as recently as the last geological epoch, the Pleistocene, they coexisted with Neanderthals, Denisovans. There are other species, Homo floresiensis, we've discovered. There are some disputed varieties, the red deer cave people from Yunnan, China, the strange and very curious Penghu 1 jaw fragment off the coast of Taiwan, and there are others I don't have time to get into. The point is, humans, as we know them today, coexisted with a wide array of different hominin cousins. fairly recently. And this has caused many anthropologists in recent years to go, maybe it's not crazy that even if they aren't still around today, that until fairly recently, some of those lingered into present times. It's not a crazy idea. More and more anthropologists are looking at that possibility. But to me, it's so strange because nothing about that is in conflict with archaeology or anthropology per se. And yet we're all willing to say, and you know what? Aliens might be visiting Earth. It really must be 2020, man. you know, right?
I'm glad you just launched into that, because that's the best recommendation I could give. If you want to go over to micahhanks.com and check out any of his shows, you have, science stuff, political stuff, Bigfoot stuff, archaeology stuff. You can start a conversation with this guy and mention pretty much any topic that affects human history, natural science, astronomy. Just throw out something. Oh, I saw a meteor. Micah can go on for a half an hour and give you the history of meteors, and he'll be right. So enjoy that. It's micahhanks.com. Thank you again, sir, for joining us. And I'll either be on one of your shows or I will drag you back here kicking and screaming again some point in the future.
I think it's your turn to come over and hang with me next time, right?
Anytime, my friend. It would be a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise, man. Always a good time.
All right, folks. That's it for today. And thanks for joining us.